Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We've been immersed in the book The Love You Make by Peter Brown for a while now, and today is the second to the last video. I thought today would be the end of the video, but there was a little more information than I realized once I got near the end. So, as I've said before, these videos don't have to be seen in any order. Each video shows events from the lives of the Beatles throughout Peter's information. And then we have to decide for ourselves whether it's true or not. So let's see what happens today. October the 9th, on John's 29th birthday, Yoko miscarried the baby she was carrying. John and Yoko were depressed by this second loss, and they took a Greek vacation with Magic Alex. They rented a small yacht and with a small crew and went into the Mediterranean. They didn't have a destination in mind. They just wanted to get away from the world. It was a 10-day cruise. They wanted to get drugs and alcohol out of their systems, and they went on a total fast except for water. It seemed to have a wrong effect on their bodies. There were physical violence between the couple and the substantial damage to the boat. More than a few times John gave Yoko a beating, just as he had done to Cynthia. When they got back to London, John released the wedding album on Apple. It was an experimental album with some recordings made at the Amsterdam Bed-In, including a long section where John and Yoko repeat each other's names in a chant. They had it in an expensively boxed set and sold it for $9, where usually most LPs at that time cost $4. It contained newspaper clippings, a plastic facsimile of a piece of wedding cake, and a copy of their marriage certificate. They released the single Cold Turkey at this time, too. November the 26th, John was reading stories about the war in Vietnam, and John decided he was ashamed to be an MBE member and would return the award to the Queen in protest. He ordered his chauffeur, Les Anthony, to drive to Mimi's and get the award. She had it on top of her TV set. She later said if she knew what he was up to, she never would have given it to him. John dictated a letter to be sent to the Queen, and it said, "Your Majesty, I'm returning this MBE in protest against Britain's involvement in the Nigeria Biafra thing, against our support of America in Vietnam, and against Cold Turkey slipping down the charts. With love, John Lennon of Bag." The Cold Turkey mention was an afterthought, and later John regretted putting the remark in the letter, thinking it cheapened the whole gesture of returning the MBE and making it a John Lennon publicity gimmick. John and Yoko delivered the medal themselves to the tradesmen's entrance at Buckingham Palace. A spokesman for the palace told the press it was ironic that John should return the medal, as the first MBEs that were returned were from people protesting that Mr. Lennon was given the award in the first place. John said, "I don't think the Queen will be embarrassed," and the spokesman said, "The Queen is above embarrassment." John then started to step up his protesting. He had an international billboard campaign in 12 major cities around the world with the message, "War is over, if you want it. Happy Christmas from John and Yoko." John and Yoko went to Tittenhurst Park for Christmas, and then they went to Denmark on December 29th. And that's where Tony Cox had moved with Kyoko and his new wife, an American girl named Melinda. Tony had been hesitant to let Kyoko see Yoko. There was no specific custody agreement when they divorced. Tony knew about John and Yoko's drug addiction, and he didn't like Kyoko being exposed to them while they were on drugs. He was also mad about the accident that happened in Scotland because Kyoko had been injured. John and Yoko went to Denmark to ask if Kyoko could spend time with them in Tittenhurst in the spring. They went to Cox's farmhouse, and he at that time was opposed to the use of any drugs, cigarettes, and alcohol, and they had to empty their pockets and luggage of any of those things before they could enter his house. Cox was involved with a group of harbingers. It was a sort of cosmic commune, and he had 2 members there to hypnotize John into giving up smoking. John agreed to do it to have things peaceful with Tony, and John and Yoko also agreed to have all their hair cut off by a woman barber in Cox's barn. And so that was kind of weird. I don't think I would have gone along with that one. A peace concert was going to be set up, but when the business office said they had to charge the people $1, John said, "No, free means free," but the promoters said that's going to be impossible to do it because all the people there, they had to cover the cost for sanitation. A month later, John was back to smoking cigarettes, so much for hypnosis, and he was also taking drugs at Tittenhurst Park, and Kyoko was with Cox, and the peace concert was canceled. January the 26th, John wrote a song called Instant Karma. It was a commercial success, especially in America, and it sold over 1 million copies. The credit can be given to Phil Spector for broadening and enriching John's sound. John was thankful, so he gave Phil Spector the raw tapes of the Let It Be and asked him to make an album out of it. Peter Brown said that John was willful, he was brilliant, and he was lost. It was times like these that it was good to have friends to give aid and encouragement. John had that, but he was also unapproachable. He had great wealth and power, and there was no controlling him. Yoko only egged him on, and John enjoyed being the outcast. It fed his martyr complex, as well as the Corey band pet in him. March 1970, Yoko was pregnant again, and she went to the London Clinic, a private hospital, for treatment. It was top secret, and no other Beatles knew about it, and the Apple employees didn't either. They did tell a few people, Magic Alex, journalist Ray Connolly, and Michael X. Michael X had given them a gift, a suitcase full of marijuana. Yoko said it was for medical reasons connected to her pregnancy, but Magic Alex remembers Yoko being given methadone, a heroin substitute used in withdrawal treatment. Yoko went back to Tittenhurst Park, and she was confined to her bed in poor condition. John was feeling closed in. Renovations were still underway, and there was always sounds of hammering and sawing. And then they started to have violent arguments, him and Yoko. And it didn't help Yoko out any. John said that they had been together 24 hours a day, and they were turning into Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. It was then that he got a book called The Primal Scream, Primal Therapy, The Cure for Neurosis. Talking on the phone with a therapist, Janoff told John and Yoko to write lengthy letters about their childhoods and what they hoped to obtain with therapy. He then flew to move in with John and Yoko at Tittenhurst from Los Angeles temporarily. Janoff told them to separate into distant rooms 24 hours before he was to arrive. They weren't to use drugs of any kind or chemicals, and not to speak on the phone or listen to the radio or watch TV. The therapy sessions, John would lie on his back spread-eagled in the middle of the floor, and he went over all the hurt and rejection of his childhood. His screams could be heard all over the house. After a week of therapy, the construction noise had them going to a large suite at the inn on the park in London. After 3 weeks, Janoff thought that they were making progress and invited them back to California, and then they could enroll in the Primal Institute in Los Angeles for a 4 to 6 month course of intensive therapy. Janoff could help John get into America for specialized medical treatment. Janoff suggested that John resolve his ambivalent feelings towards Julian. John went to Kensington to see him. Cynthia said he was surprisingly pleasant. He went up to Julian's room and they played for several hours. John later went downstairs to have a cup of tea with Cynthia and told her about the primal therapy. Yoko wasn't mentioned. Then the phone rang and the housekeeper came in hysterical because Yoko was threatening to take an overdose of sleeping pills because John was spending too much time with Cynthia and Julian. John slammed down the phone and shouted, "That silly biatch. She's threatening to kill herself." Sounded like she was a bit insecure to be doing that. After that, all communications and arrangements about Julian were made by Yoko. Cynthia didn't hear from John after that. But we all know in another book, I think he did speak to Cynthia again, trying to get together to see Julian, who was a teenager by then. When they were in Los Angeles, Yoko miscarried John's third child, and she had bed rest a few days and then joined John in primal therapy. John liked the screaming, he liked having a good cry and then swim in the pool. Yoko didn't buy Janoff's therapy. John said later Yoko only went along with it to satisfy him. She thought that John was searching for another daddy, and she thought it was useful for men who needed to cry and release themselves. Yoko was familiar with that because she would scream and cry in her private life as well as on records and stage. Later, John got disillusioned with Janoff just like he had with Maharishi. One day, Janoff came to the sessions with 2 16mm cameras. John said he wouldn't be filmed, especially not rolling around on the floor screaming. John said Janoff started to say negative things. He said some people are so big they won't be filmed. John and Yoko were in the pool one day and looked at each other and realized that they were the ones to say when therapy was over. And one day in June, John went to the Primal Therapy Center and said to Janoff, "Well, we're cured. Thank you." And then they left Los Angeles the next day. The primal therapy helped in one way. It brought back the artist in John, and he created the John Lennon / Plastic Ono album. Paul was following John's adventures in the newspapers, and he was disgusted and dismayed. John was making a fool of himself, and Paul felt he needed to break away before John dragged him down too. Paul decided to make an album of his own. Paul and his family went to High Park in Scotland to record his first solo album. He only told Derek Taylor about it. The success of Abbey Road had the attention turning to Paul, and he felt he needed to get out of the limelight. October the 12th, 1969, an American disc jockey named Russ Gibb on a Detroit station WKNR-FM got an anonymous phone call saying that Paul was dead. It was mentioned that in the end of the song Strawberry Fields, which when played backwards could be deciphered as John chanting, "I buried Paul." This wasn't true, of course, but after the broadcast, everybody kept calling in asking if it was true that Paul was dead. Peter said that none of us found the rumor at all amusing, and sternly assured all callers that Paul was alive and in good health and enjoying himself. They wanted to protect his privacy, so they didn't reveal where he was. And there was even a magazine that stated that Paul was killed in a traffic accident, and they got that from the song A Day in the Life. He was decapitated, they said. And then an actor named William Campbell had undergone plastic surgery to fool the public. Finally, Derek told the reporters that Paul was on his farm in Scotland, but that didn't seem to help either. Paul, in the meantime, wanted to stay in Scotland and not say anything. Life magazine decided to pay a visit. Paul got angry and threatened them, but then he thought the better of it and granted them an interview. In March 1970, Paul released his solo album, McCartney. When Paul got to London, he called John and said, "I'm doing what you and Yoko are doing. I'm putting out an album and leaving the group." John couldn't believe that Paul even thought that there was a band to go back to, and John said, "Good, that makes two of us who've accepted it mentally." Paul wanted his album to come out in April, and Klein said it was out of the question. That was the date of the Let It Be album, so Paul went to Sir Joseph for help. "I'm being sabotaged, Sir Joe. That's what they're doing to me." And then Sir Joe said he would try to help, but it was up to the other Beatles. Ringo went to Paul's house to mediate, and then Paul flew into a rage and screamed, "I'll finish you all. You'll pay," and he gave Ringo his coat and threw him out of the house. Ringo told John and George that it meant so much to Paul to have his solo album released in April, and they should let him do it, just to show friendship. Ringo's own solo album was pushed back, and the release of Let It Be pushed up. In the end, all three albums hit the market within 3 or 4 weeks of each other, so it wasn't a very good marketing decision. Paul didn't like how Phil Spector had the wall of sound on the album Let It Be, along with the female background voices. And George Harrison, after the release of the Let It Be, went to the studio of Phil Spector and worked 6 months on his album, All Things Must Pass. Ringo decided he better make an album too, so he went to Nashville producer Peter Drake to work on the Buku of Blues. It took only 6 days to make. April the 10th, Paul announced to the newspapers that he was leaving the Beatles because of personal, business, and musical differences. In 1970, Paul and the Eastmans kept trying to keep Paul out of partnership contracts. The tax burden would be enormous if they split up the funds. Paul didn't want to be a part of Klein's ABKCO managed industry. Paul said he would sue Klein, and Klein laughed because he'd been sued by others 40 times before. Paul then tried to talk to each Beatle individually. John and George didn't want to listen to him, and Paul invited Ringo to his house. Paul said it wasn't the rest of the group, it was Klein, and Ringo said it wasn't just Klein, it was the Eastmans too. Linda started to cry hysterically, and Ringo stopped talking. Ringo tried to defend Klein, and Linda would cry, and no solution was made. Paul tried writing a long letter to John about agreeing to a formal dissolution. All he got back was a cartoon drawing from John with the words "how" and "why" in a bubble. John wrote back saying by signing a piece of paper agreeing to dissolve the Apple partnership. Why? Because we don't have a partnership anymore. John responded with a postcard, "Get well soon." It said, "Get the other signatures and I will think about it." In December at St. John's Wood, Paul mulled if he had the heart to sue the other Beatles. He just wanted to go after Klein. He didn't want to be the villain, but he ended up doing it. He did it of all times. New Year's Eve, he served John, George, and Ringo with Ritz on December 31st, 1970. Peter handed in his resignation the same day. Robert Stigwood had asked Peter to join his very successful company, and Klein had wanted Peter out of the way anyway. So the court trial began on January the 10th, 1971, and it lasted for 9 days. Paul was the only one to show up at court. The 3 others were represented only by affidavits. It was read out loud in the court and showed up in the headlines the next day. Paul and his attorney stated that Alan Klein was unscrupulous and they feared for Paul's interest. And John, George, and Ringo stated that Klein had drawn only $150,000 commission from the group since he joined in. Klein had doubled the Beatles' record royalties of the first 8.5 years. March 10th, the High Court appointed Mr. J.D. Spooner as receiver of the Beatles' assets. As a group, Alan Klein no longer represented the Beatles, but he still represented John, George, and Ringo. They were all trying to unfreeze the money, but tax was a problem. A large tax would have to be paid almost immediately. There were a lot of interviews where mean things were said, and the Beatle fans were disillusioned by the nastiness of the trial. So I will end the video here. I really thought I could wrap up the book in this video, but there's so much to go over, it wasn't possible. The next video will definitely be the end of the book. In this episode, we found out more about John and Yoko, and they sure did get around. So John and Yoko got into primal therapy, and then, as they had with the Maharishi, they became disillusioned and decided they wanted out. And Yoko miscarried three times. I didn't realize that happened to her so many times. And she and John wanted to spend time with Yoko's daughter, but Tony didn't trust her being with them in their drugged-out lifestyle. Paul created a solo album just as John had, and Ringo also came out with his own solo album. The Beatles fought each other because Paul didn't want Klein as his manager, and Ringo, George, and John didn't want the Eastmans as their lawyers, so no one was willing to bend. Next, we'll find out what each Beatle ended up doing after the breakup, so this should be interesting, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.